Well, as I mentioned before, my name is Mindy Farmer. I'm the newest historian here at the National Portrait Gallery. It's such an honor to be here, and it's such an honor to be doing these programs. And we're so happy today to be joined by historian Julio Capó Jr. and scholar Lawrence La Fountain-Stokes to talk about the legacy and life of Latinx transgender activist Sylvia Rivera. And I do want to say that although we are tuning in together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gathered, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. And we are so pleased to present today's event as part of the Tommie L. Pegues and Donald A. Capoccia Conversation Series. And we welcome you all of our viewers from around the world. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you both to Tom and Don. And again, if you have thoughts during the presentation, feel free to use the chat. You'll see that we'll put a few links in there as things come up. So feel free to use that. But if you do have a question, we ask that you use the Q&A function. And that's where we'll be taking the questions at the end. And I know you will all have some really interesting questions because this presentation will be fantastic. And I want to make sure that we thank Tommie Pegues, who has served as one of the National Portrait Gallery's commissioners since 2015. He and his husband, Don, have been dedicated supporters of the Portrait Gallery since 2008, and we are so grateful for them. They are focused on the arts, and their continued friendship enables us to further our mission to explore the history of the United States and biography through identity. And I want to read a statement on their behalf. So this is from Tommie and Don. Don and I are honored to sponsor this program as we especially want to continue to create a safe space to discuss critical issues around LGBTQ plus identity and art. We join the National Portrait Gallery in their belief that queer history is American history and should be featured in programming. With that in mind, we're looking forward to tonight's presentations with scholars Julio Capó Jr. and Larry La Fountain-Stokes, celebrating the life of transgender activist Sylvia Rivera. Her bravery is an example to us all. So thank you for being here, for your curiosity, and for joining us in the belief that portraiture is powerful. And we definitely thank Tommie and Don for sponsoring this program. And now I'd like to welcome Julio and Larry. And I invite them to turn on. Hello, both of you. While they're here, I want to make sure that we give them their formal introduction. So Julio Capó Jr. is Associate Professor of History and Deputy Director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Welcome to Fairyland, Queer Miami Before 1940, and the curator of several exhibitions. And if you haven't read Welcome to Fairyland, you should. It's fantastic. His work has appeared in top academic journals as well as mainstream media outlets, including Time, El Nuevo Diva from Puerto Rico, the Miami Herald, and the Washington Post, where he now serves as editor of its Made by History section. Capó's held fellowships at Yale University and the University of Sydney, and has been named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. Welcome, Julio. And Larry La Fountain-Stokes is the professor and chair of the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's also professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and of Women's and Gender Studies. He has a very full plate. He is author of Queer Ricans, Cultures and Sexualities in the Diaspora, Universities of Minnesota Press, 2009, and Translocas, The Politics of Puerto Rican Drag Trans Performance from the University of Michigan Press in 2021. Larry has been performing drag as Lola Van Miramar since 2010 and has appeared in several episodes of the YouTube cooking series, Cooking with Drag Queens, and I can't recommend that enough. If you have some time after the show, go look that up. It's fantastic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Julio and Larry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mindy, and thanks to everyone at the National Portrait Gallery. It's such an honor to be here. I just want to start by embarrassing Larry slightly by saying that it is such an honor to be here in conversation with him. It's someone, so Larry's someone who I greatly admire, whose work I greatly admire, has been a great inspiration to me and to so many scholars, and that we all owe you a huge thank you for the great work that you've done, and continue to do, especially in documenting and advancing Latinx studies, gender, sexuality, and cultural studies. So just, it's an honor to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. You're very kind. And I'm also very fond of your work, which has been so amazing and transformative in terms of learning about the queer history of Miami and Florida.
Thank you, Larry. Let's stop this love fest. Let's stop it and get to work. So let's get down to it. And there's so much to talk about. Sylvia Rivera is so many things. And her memory, her legacy. I want to begin just by thinking about, it's only in 2015, so not long ago, that Sylvia Rivera became the first portrait of a trans woman, of a trans person, any trans person, right? That was acquired by the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. So her photo with fellow activists that we see here on the screen with fellow activist Christina Hayworth and her partner Julia Murray is now on display in the Struggle for Justice Gallery. So just to get us going, can we, and by the way, it's long overdue and we're very proud of this moment. Tell us about Sylvia Rivera, her early life, and why is it so important that she is in that gallery?
It's actually incredible. It's amazing. It's extraordinary that Sylvia Rivera is in the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, and that she is the first transgender person is mind-blowing, and that she is in this gorgeous photo by the Puerto Rican gay photographer Luis Carle, sitting between Christina Hayworth and Julia Murray. Your hair stand up. Why? Because Sylvia Rivera was really a pioneer. She was at the Stonewall riots, although some people have tried to challenge that. What we do know for sure, and there is absolutely zero debate about, is that starting in 1969 and 1970, she was fighting and advocating for trans people's rights and queer of color people's rights. And I think the word fighting is a really adequate word, because there was lots of resistance to what Sylvia Rivera was saying as a homeless person, as a person of color, who was a Latina, a Puerto Rican Venezuelan, who spoke what some people describe as broken English or Hispanic English, who was advocating for the experience or the lives and situations of people who were incarcerated for working in prostitution, because that was the only job they could have. Not only that, but who were suffering violence, who were being raped in prison. So she really challenged and she really pushed the LGBT movement, which back then was really the gay and lesbian movement. First of all, to acknowledge people of color, to acknowledge poor people, to acknowledge transgender people, to acknowledge homeless people as part of the community, part of the social movements in the context of the broader civil rights struggle. So she was a radical. She was a radical Latina, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan hellraiser. I love these words, and they're very dramatic, but she was a dramatic person. She was a very angry person at moments, but she was also a person who had a vision and was able to articulate that vision clearly and to try to mobilize other people. And she faced such enormous challenges. So she was forgotten for many years. She kept coming and going. And I think it's just remarkable that the Smithsonian Institution and the National Portrait Gallery are recognizing the profound legacy that all of us have, the debt of gratitude that we have to Sylvia Rivera.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. Well said. To think about Sylvia Rivera and I especially want to, thread a little bit more of what you just said about the rage, right? The anger, the utility of rage, and how productive and generative it was to articulating her vision. That is, if you're not going to let me speak, I'm going to speak, right? This is exactly the kind of activist, thinker, person, right, that she was. There was no doubt that she was not going to let us forget, right? In some ways, it's not incidental that she's the first, right?
And if you think of lesbian Black thinkers like Audre Lorde, feminist thinkers who really encourage us to have to acknowledge that at some specific moments, rage and anger are just absolutely necessary if we want to bring about social change.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Larry. Let's go back to something you brought up a minute ago, the role of Sylvia Rivera in the Stonewall Rebellion. It's still often cited as a kind of point of contestation, of controversy, of misunderstanding, et cetera, no? But you have done so much important research providing the needed nuance and the clarification to help us understand this. What do we know and what is still unclear? And then I think, maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. What we know is that very important historians such as Martin Duberman understood that Sylvia Rivera could talk about Stonewall, claim to have been at Stonewall, and really inform us of the complexity of Stonewall was. People like to have narratives the same way that they like to have heroes and they like to have landmark events. So in spite of the fact that there have been multiple rebellions and struggles for civil rights pertaining to LGBT, Stonewall was the moment that catalyzed, that crystallized all of this anger, this frustration. What we know is that Sylvia Rivera was able to talk about Stonewall. For example, when I invited her in 2001 to a meeting of Latino gay men, that she shared compelling narratives about what that riot was like, but that she also could talk and tell us about what happened after Stonewall. After Stonewall, when it started in 1970, activists start to organize to have marches and parades, and the Gay Lesbian Front and the Gay Activist Alliance and other activist groups really take off. We know that Sylvia Rivera participated in protests at NYU. We know that she was arrested in Times Square in New York City because she was canvassing for signatures to try to change the law. We know that journalists started writing about Sylvia Rivera in 1970, 1971. They started to co-author pieces with her. She published pieces in radical gay publications. We know that in 1973, she gave an extraordinary speech in Washington Square Park in New York City because people did not want to listen to her. They did not want to talk about transgender experience, which was back then referred to with different words. They did not want to talk about homelessness. And she had a mission. She had a message that she wanted to convey. When I was a graduate student in the 1990s in New York, I read Martin Duberman's book, Stonewall. It was a transformative experience. For me, reading Martin Duberman's account of Sylvia Rivera and other participants, and not only participants, but people who were part of that extraordinary moment at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. Reading about Sylvia Rivera in Martin Duberman's book, and then realizing that all you needed to do was to go to Fifth Avenue on the day of the Pride Parade, and she was always there. You could walk up to her. And for me, it was like walking up to history, because in the 1990s, she was as committed to fighting anti-trans violence as she had been in the early 1970s.
And you gave us so much to unpack just there. I'm gonna try to thread some of it because that's so many great points you made. And I just want to add something to something you said, that is, also the telling of the past is so uneven, right? That is, whose stories get recorded, whose stories get told. and how which ones are preserved to those looking at this PowerPoint, Martin Duberman versus David Carter's books, the role of Sylvia Rivera is very different in these, right? In Duberman's, right, as you noted, she's central, and in the other actually ceases to exist. And there's a long narrative of erasure and marginalization, no doubt, of trans and genderqueer and people of color. I also just want to kind of unpack the memory of oral histories, of testimonies, especially for such a traumatic and violent event, right? That is, decades later, when asked about, so often they talk about inconsistencies in stories and kind of holding people very, very, stringently accountable for their words, which of course we need to, I'm not suggesting that that's not how history is done, but that's not what memory looks like. And that's not how humanity works. That this is a violent and very traumatic experience to relive. And so also, what is Stonewall if not a collective of experiences? And not, she is Stonewall, right? That is, she is a collective of, she was part of a force that started so much, right? That not, or continued that so much, no doubt.
So for me, the question is almost irrelevant whether Sylvia really was at Stonewall, although I heard her say that she was there. I heard her at a Latino Gay Men of New York meeting recount in detail, without a script, what it was like to be there. But whether she was actually there or not, whether there are other people who can corroborate her story or not, I think misses the point. That what is truly extraordinary is that Sylvia used the Stonewall narrative, the attention that Stonewall gathered in her activism in the early 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. She used it to try to empower a profoundly marginalized community that very few people wanted to listen to. Nobody wanted to know about homeless LGBT people. Nobody wanted to know about people of color, and much less about transgender women. So the fact that David Carter did not include Sylvia Rivera in his book on Stonewall, I think is violent. I think it is unfortunate. I think it is good that other people such as Martin Duberman, and not only Martin Duberman, David Issei and many others have recognized or have tried to acknowledge the centrality of Sylvia Rivera as a pioneer at her historical moment.
I love that. I mean, Stonewall is nothing if not a collective of forces. It's not one, it's not an hour, it's not a few hours, it's not a few nights. It's a movement, right? Too. I mean, in this, along with others like Marsha P. Johnson, who we'll talk about in just a minute.
And in fact, because if you look at the cover of Martin Duberman's book, there is Sylvia Rivera with Marsha P. Johnson, one of the other founders of Street Transvestite Action Revolutionary STAR, which became an extraordinary group in this moment of multiple groups fighting for social justice.
So I want to follow so much of this thread, and we'll return to some of this, but we all heard you say something that we're not going to let go easily. That is, Larry met Sylvia Rivera. You got to tell us more. You got to tell us a little bit more. Tell us about that moment.
She was an intense person. She was cranky. She was very opinionated. She had a deep voice. She was brilliant. She was banned from going into the Gay and Lesbian Center because in her commitment to social justice and her frustration with the lack of awareness about the homeless youth who were sleeping in front of the center, she ripped apart the front desk. So to get her into the Gay and Lesbian Center in New York City in 2001, we needed to get security and special permissions. I have the prescience of bringing a tape recorder. I tape recorded one of her talks, which has been shared. And I am so happy to have had that opportunity. And it just kind of reminds you how, as a graduate student, as everyday person, you might be witnessing history, and whatever you can do to document and to encourage more people to learn about it. Like, 20 years later, here we are talking about Sylvia Rivera at the Smithsonian Institution National Portrait Gallery, something that I would have never have anticipated when I was in my late 20s, early 30s in New York City.
Wow, there's so much there. Thank you for that. I can only imagine how incredibly powerful and you even just to hear you talk about it, how meaningful that was for you as one of our elders and ancestors, to see, that is for her to us. I want to talk a little bit more about STAR. I want to talk about what was STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and just, to give a sense, the language here is changing and being contested. That is, oftentimes we see words like transvestite in this moment. Sometimes we see transgender in later periods. And other times we see transsexual, right? The terms are kind of in flux in this period, as they often are, right? The terms are changing and they accrue new meaning. And as people like Sylvia Rivera are coming to terms with their own understanding of gender and sexuality, which she no doubt was a really powerful articulator of all these things, but the language itself is often in flux. I just want to say that out loud, right? So what was so revolutionary about STAR, and what was the relationship between this bond, right, between Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson?
So STAR was an extraordinary organization which did not last very long. They used a word which has fallen out of favor. The word transgender did not exist or was not in wide circulation in 1970-71. The word that was employed by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson was transvestite. So that is almost lesson number one, when consulting the historical record, to acknowledge how language changes. What were the words that people used? What did they mean to those people? So to those people, to Sylvia, to Marsha, it meant they were marking a difference with gay and lesbian. Gay might have served as an umbrella term, but it did not account for the specificity of what Sylvia and Marsha and other women of color, other transgender persons were experiencing. So STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, was organized to address homelessness. It was organized to address the fact that many youth were kicked out of their homes, were living on the street. You could not get a job. The only job you could get was prostitution. Many of these youth were being incarcerated, youth and also adults. So STAR organized, its goals were to find housing, were to find an apartment or an abandoned trailer or any place where people could sleep, which was less dangerous than sleeping on the street. STAR was one of the multiple groups that are coalescing at this moment. I mentioned the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activist Alliance. Those were also groups that Sylvia was part of, but she was also a part of the Young Lords. The Young Lords were a radical Puerto Rican Latinx group of young people who were organizing to try to address issues of discrimination and poverty. She came in contact with the Black Panthers. She was in contact with people struggling against the Vietnam War. She was aware of the feminist movement. So all of these movements, they're intersecting with each other. STAR did not last for a very long time. It was very small, but it was really momentous if we think of the history of the development of transgender activism at a historical moment where there was very limited awareness of that. So STAR, people refer to STAR now more and more as Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries. I love this banner. I love this photo from 1973. This is precisely the year that Sylvia Rivera gave that extraordinary speech, which is available on YouTube and Vimeo, which I highly encourage people to listen to. Sylvia explaining and advocating for the needs of the population, the group that she felt that she belonged to and that was not being addressed.
You gave us so much good nuggets there. So many things to talk. I love this so much. It is so much, it's so generative. And I want to return to 1973 in just a second. But one of the things that I read from your statements here, which are so critical, in some ways, right, Sylvia Rivera, like Marsha P. Johnson, helps us understand this moment, right? Like it's a snapshot of the many movements, of the many intersecting identities and plights and challenges. You know, if we think about what we call historiography, right? Like that is the kind of history of historical interpretations, like what have people said about a particular event. Stonewall didn't happen overnight, right? I mean, like there were decades of you know, prior to that, we have the homophile movement. There were certainly a cultural, you know, political, the politics of culture, like, you know, bars and all these kinds of things, right, that paved the way for something like, but Stonewall is also incredibly important and incredibly influential, no doubt. And even as it's kind of checkered, it doesn't reach everybody the same way. But we also kind of see, you know, as we talked earlier, it's not just Carter and Duperman, right? There's so many new works, whether it's film, like Tourmarine's, you know, new film, you know, Mark Stein has a new documentary reader on that helps us kind of analyze all these moments. But there's a long history here that is like, there wasn't, how do you start a movement when there's invisibility, right? That is like when people are not necessarily coming out. And Sylvia Rivera challenges that, like trans people and gender nonconforming people were never okay with that, right? For 1,000 reasons. And it sounds like, yeah.
And I would say, so it's really not just invisibility,
Right.
although that clearly is part of it, and that is a useful word, but resistance, open resistance.
Yeah.
On the side of gay men who are misogynist and femphobic, are against effeminate homosexuals,
right.
Because they don't see them as advancing the gay cause, but also among lesbian and feminists who are profoundly resistant to transgender experience.
Sure.
So in many ways, the struggles that Sylvia Rivera faced in terms of classism, racism, misogyny, and transphobia, she experienced them in the late 60s and early 70s. But those are things that we continue to fight with, to challenge. So trans exclusionary radical feminism was at work in 1973 when Jean O'Leary wanted to prevent Sylvia from speaking at the end of the Christopher Street Day parade. And it is still in place today when feminists and other people continue to reject the humanity and the gender expression and the self-identification of transgender people. So Sylvia Rivera was grappling with these very profound issues 50 years or more than 50 years ago. They are issues that we continue to struggle with today.
For sure. That was really well said. Thank you for that. And to think about all the influences, right? That is, since of course Stonewall didn't happen overnight, the influence of the anti-war movement, the counterculture, the women's liberation movement, but especially the Black rights movement, right? Like, so when we hear in some of the images we've seen, right, when we see gay power, which was something Sylvia Rivera often said, right, the parallel between Black power and gay power, or gay is good, and its parallels to Black is beautiful. That is the clear influence of all these things, right?
So Sylvia was committed to revolution.
Right.
Sylvia was committed to transformation. And for us, Sylvia is really exemplary in terms of intersectionality. So the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, Sylvia encapsulates perfectly the complexity of what that means. So intersectional theory from feminism, from legal criticism, from critical legal studies, really allows us to understand what Sylvia was up to and why her intervention is so crucial. And it explains why the National Portrait Gallery has a photo by Luis Carle of Sylvia Rivera. Because she is important. She transforms society, and the National Portrait Gallery, that is what they do. They recognize people that have made a valuable intervention in American society in some way or form.
Well said. Well said. Let's revisit this moment in 1973, a very difficult time. And if, as Larry said, if we encourage you to see this, you know, the clips of this video, this moment in 1973 when Sylvia Rivera has to, forces herself onto the stage, right? If you're not going to silence me, if you're not going to let me speak, I'm going to make sure you hear me speak. And it's such a powerful testimony. I should note, by Love Tapes Collective, right? Lesbians organized for video experience. And it's after 1973, Rivera largely withdraws from public sight and from activism for a little bit, right? Actually, not for a little bit, for almost 2 decades. And
Yes.
Tell us about that, and why did she come back?
Hi. It's a painful and extraordinary story, but on the 4th anniversary of Stonewall in 1973, at the end of the 4th parade, there is a rally, as we continue to have, or at least had before the COVID pandemic. And as you know, it is a moment for entertainment and celebration, but it is also a moment to share political messages and to share information. So some people felt it was inappropriate for a homeless Black Puerto Rican transgender woman to get on stage to talk about her group. She wanted to talk about STAR. She wanted to invite people to STAR meetings. She wanted people to address the fact that police were routinely abusing incarcerated transgender persons. She wanted the mainstream, predominantly middle-class, white, gay, and lesbian movement to shift its orientation, to widen its interest, to recognize poverty, to recognize incarceration, to recognize labor as issues that were as central as anything else. That it was not just a struggle against sodomy laws, and it was certainly not just a struggle for gay marriage or gays in the military. It was about people who didn't have a place to sleep. So she struggles to get on stage. They start booing her from the very beginning. She gives a profoundly moving speech. At the end, you can see her exhaustion. She gets the whole audience to spell out the words gay power. It is a very brief speech. It is probably no more than 3 or 4 minutes. But you see that she is an extraordinary orator in the tradition of Martin Luther King, in the tradition of Malcolm X, in the tradition of Sylvia Rivera. She had picked up the cues about how do you speak to an audience? How do you generate interest in what you're saying, even among people who don't share that experience? So she was a gifted speaker. She was a powerful speaker. She was also profoundly human. So for me, at the end of her talk, when she barely has the energy to continue, you really feel that pain. You feel the pain of what it's like to be booed by an audience. So it is a video that I'm so thankful to the Love Tapes Collective. It's really a blessing. It is extraordinary that they have safeguarded this historical memory. I love showing it to students because it's really very transformative, or to any group. When people, they don't know who Sylvia Rivera is, they might not have thought very much about transgender issues. They certainly don't think about the intersections of homelessness and being a person of color and being working class and being transgender. So Sylvia Rivera synthesizes all of these things, and that is one of her major contributions. And if you get one takeaway from today's activity and from Sylvia Rivera's photo, I think that is a good way to think of her.
I keep saying well said, but it's just so true.
Thank you.
I sound like a recorder. One of the things that I take away from that too is with the work you've done, with the work that others like Roderick Ferguson, for example, to take Sylvia Rivera very seriously as a thinker, as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a revolutionary, to give her dues in that way too, which so often she's not, right?
And in transgender studies, so
Yeah.
in transgender studies, people like Susan Stryker, you mentioned Tourmaline, and many others have realized, Jack Halberstam, they have realized if we are going to think of transgender experience, but also transgender theory, transgender activism, transgender interventions, who are we talking about? And who are the people who have been doing this work? So Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson are some of the people who were really pioneers, at least in the American context, in the 1960s and 70s.
Perfect. Wait, so I think we have time for one more kind of question, and then before we open it up, but what should we take away from Sylvia? How is he, today she's increasingly celebrated and memorialized. What do people have to learn, to stand to learn about Sylvia Rivera, her legacy, and her life?
I love this photo that we are seeing now on the screen. Sylvia is by a fountain, and she just looks much happier and more beautiful than she has in some of the other photos that we have seen. So the takeaway is that social struggles are important, that intersectionality is crucial, that this transgender, formerly homeless, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, Latina woman who wasn't fluent in Spanish and spoke what people felt was marginal English, was able to make an extraordinary contribution that has been recognized by historians, by journalists, by artists, that she has inspired Hollywood films. She appears in all sorts of documentaries, that this struggle is ongoing.
Yes.
It has been going on for many, many decades, but that we can do things. We can read, we can learn more about Sylvia, we can watch films, we can go to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. to visit the photo by Luis Carle. I'm so thankful that Luis Carle, who is a Puerto Rican gay photographer in New York City, was there that day in 2000 and just took that photo with Christina Hayworth, who was also at Stonewall, who established the first gay pride parade in San Juan, Puerto Rico in 1990. That Sylvia was there with Julia Murray. So that challenges our conceptions of transgender couples and who people hang out with and who are people's friends. So I think to continue to learn not only about Sylvia, but about Sylvia and about Marsha and about so many other transgender people of color who have come since that time is really crucial.
I love that. That is Sylvia Rivera and all the names that we do not yet know and need to know and should know. As a side note, I'm with you with everything you said, but in that image, there's something just so strikingly stunning about that image. I also think, goodness, if I was to lie on that edge, I would just fall into the fountain. And I'm just like, not on purpose, just I don't have the style. She had such style and grace here, and it's such a great photo, and the power of the photographer in these kinds of moments, like that photo with Julia and Christina, is so powerful. It tells us so many stories. Yeah. I think we should open. I know I'm following my rules. I'm trying to stick to the book as much as I can. Which I want to have this conversation with Larry for another 10 years. But let's open it up to Q&A. Is that right, Mindy?
Yes, please make sure if you have any questions for either Larry or Julio. Julio has written about this to some degree as well, and maybe that's a great place to start. Julio, can you talk about how you've written about Sylvia Rivera?
I've largely written about the kind of role of Latinx LGBTQ folks as a kind of culture of resistance and resilience, where Sylvia Rivera obviously plays such a critical role. We can see such a long legacy of again, Stonewall didn't exist in isolation. There's so many kind of forms and manifestations of what Stonewall is and isn't, right? So there were so many other events prior and certainly after. There were Latinx caucus groups in cities. There were people who showed up to queer bars, and I've been working to trace those, right? To like, how do we recover the voices, people who were left out of, not permitted to enter U.S. Borders, right? Whose names have never been recorded, whose stories have never been told, but tell us such a powerful role about the way that Latinx folks have historically, and people of color at large, have played a massive role in changing and advancing LGBTQ rights. And even though they're often not given the credit for that, but that is, what Sylvia Rivera represents is I love the way that Larry put it, is also resistance and resilience and power and in the individual, right? Like, why do we study individuals? Because individuals can change the world, right? And it sounds so cheesy, but it's true.
And it's just so interesting. So for example, at the end of her life, Sylvia Rivera became very involved with the Metropolitan Community Church.
Yes.
So how faith, a religion, brought people together, a queer church, a LGBT church, something very different from what she was doing in the early 1970s. Although historians and people have noted that Sylvia always brought with her folk Catholicism, her life experience witnessing Pentecostalism, her having grown up in contexts where Afro-diasporic religions, such as Santeria. So that's a dimension of Sylvia Rivera's experience that we have not necessarily addressed. So there's so much to learn about Sylvia, but also about what was happening in California, for example, at the very same moment. So Susan Stryker, for example, on her work on Compton's Cafeteria, has pointed out that Stonewall was not the only moment of rebellion, early rebellion in those early 1960s. So there's so much to learn. And we're at a very exciting moment in which there are more and more transgender scholars and authors who are also telling this story. So as a cisgender Puerto Rican gay man, I feel privileged that I had the opportunity to meet Sylvia. Sylvia has been a light in my way. She has transformed my scholarship and my personal life. But at the same time, I am a cisgender gay Puerto Rican man. So I think it's really important to have multiplicity of voices contributing and widening this conversation.
Well, thank you. And I want to get to some of the questions because they're fantastic. And I'm going to start with, what do we know about her parents and the grandmother that raised her?
So we know very little. We know that her father was Puerto Rican and that her mother was Venezuelan, that her father disappeared early on, that her mother committed suicide and tried to get Sylvia to kill herself along with her, but Sylvia survived. That she was raised by her Venezuelan grandmother in the Bronx, who she called Viejita. So Jessie Gann, who is a transgender scholar, has a beautiful chronology building on multiple sources, which was published in 2007 in Centro Journal. So that is a really beautiful piece to read. I published a piece also more recently in a critical reader on Latinx studies. We know that by the time that Sylvia was 8 or 9, she was already sexually active. She was profoundly effeminate, and her grandmother was abusive and very upset. And that is right around the time when Sylvia runs away. So Sylvia runs away around the age of 9 or 10. She goes to live in Times Square, New York City, becomes homeless. And we don't know that she had very much contact with her family after that, or if she did, it's not documented. So that would be really fascinating to try to learn more about her early history.
Great question.
Yeah, here's another kind of interesting one for you both. And I know it's not exactly historical, but it's interesting. What do you think Sylvia Rivera's view would be regarding the increasing corporatization of pride alongside the opening up of the LGBTQ movement to more diverse audiences?
Ooh, great question. You want me to take a stab, Larry?
Sure, please go ahead.
As a historian, I always have such a hard time with like the kind of counterfactual history, because I'm like, oh, I'm going to get it wrong, because who knows, right? We're nothing if not a reflection of our present, right? It's a current debate in the AHA for some weird reason. And that is, our present is very much imbued by our past, no doubt. there's something really, I imagine she would have fought very, very hard for that, against that shift, right? That is with the corporatization and the capital, essentially as a kind of extension of capitalism. I imagine that it would have been a very difficult thing to see as like, talking about gay power and pride alongside Drink Smirnoff or something, right? Like that would have been a very difficult image for her to comprehend, as she often talked about even, right? I see Larry nodding his head.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, so we know that for a fact.
Yeah.
We know that for a fact because that was already a conversation in the 1990s and early 2000s. And she was, I forget the expression, she was very authentic to the 1960s and 70s civil rights struggles that she came out of, which really informed her worldview and who she was and her politics and her mission, her vision. So her vision was about challenging US interventions globally. It was about anti-racist at its very core. It was about challenging capitalism, the exclusion in terms of labor exclusions, in terms of homelessness. So at no moment at all did she ever give any sign that she was becoming more comfortable with the mainstreaming of American society. She was thankful that she was recognized at Stonewall 25 in 1994, but although people immediately forgot about her, she was very grateful that she was recognized as a mother of the LGBT movement at Pride in Rome, Italy, and that she got to go to Italy and to talk. But she was really very grassroots, ground-oriented. Towards the end of her life, she was organizing marches regarding the murder of Amanda Milan. She was working with the Metropolitan Community Church really in terms of feeding people. So her politics were never strayed. She was very concerned with HIV and AIDS. She wanted people to have healthcare access. So those were really Sylvia Rivera's obsessions. They were what she put her energy and her time into. So I think that she was profoundly intersectional. She was profoundly aware. So she always brought together the conversation of racism, misogyny, classism, and transphobia. Whether she used those words or she just expressed that sentiment. That is my sense of who she was, or that is what I get from the multiple interviews with her, the transcription of her speeches, and the very limited number of articles that she wrote or co-authored.
Yes, she never wavered in her positions on these things. That's 100. I mean, that's clear from the start.
And until the day of her death, she was angry at the LGBT movement. She felt betrayed. Not simply personally. She felt that poor people, people of color, transgender people, incarcerated LGBT people, homeless LGBT people were being abandoned by the mainstream LGBT movement. So she was frustrated that people were not focusing all of their energies in challenging anti-trans violence. She felt that that was the #1 priority for the LGBT movement, not gay marriage, not gays in the military, not gay assimilation, that it was violence against transgender people what we should all be focusing on.
Rings so true still today, goodness.
Well, I think we're only going to be able to answer one more question, even though thank you all, these are such fantastic questions, but I'm going to give a nod to this question for the art historians. Given the complexity of Sylvia Rivera, they'd love to hear you speak, both of you, about the role of that single photograph versus multiple images and sources in honoring and understanding Sylvia Rivera. So can you speak to the importance of that particular photograph?
Yeah. So I am personally excited that a photo by a gay Puerto Rican is the photo that was acquired by the National Portrait Gallery. And it's a photo that is not an individual portrait, but actually a collective portrait because I think Sylvia Rivera was not interested in being a hero or a star. I mean, she was a star, but she was, for her, star always meant many people. It was always a collective endeavor. So the fact that Christina Hayworth, who was Puerto Rican, Sylvia Rivera, and Julia Murray all are in this photo, that really, and that there is a cardboard sign that says respect trans, that it's in New York City. The photo is so rich, tells us so much. Luis Carle is such an extraordinary photographer that really merits learning more about. But at the same time, I think to do justice to Sylvia Rivera, you need to see many different photos.
Yeah.
And you need to read many different books, and you need to see how she has been portrayed in not only in documentary films, but also in narrative films, in fictional films, where people have taken extraordinary liberties, especially in the films titled Stonewall, which I highly recommend, that I recommend with a critical perspective. There is really good scholarship on the fictional representation of Sylvia, on the documentary film representation of Sylvia. And it would be really interesting to read more and learn more about the photographic register. So sometimes we don't know who the photographers are, and in some cases we do. So that is one of the challenges, but we do know very specifically that the photo currently at the National Portrait Gallery is by Luis Carle, a Puerto Rican photographer based in New York, who is gay.
Amazing. I love the kind of back, behind the camera, the Luis Garli, and this powerful image of to me the faces, their stern faces, the way they look to Luis is so powerful, and the hand holding, it's layered upon layer upon layer. This picture tells us 1,000 stories, and it's exactly why portraiture is so meaningful. Yeah.
And I saw that Taina was in the chat earlier. We do want to make sure we thank her for bringing this in, because she did amazing work. And
thank you, Taina.
Thank you.
Do either of you have any last thoughts you want to share? We just a couple more minutes. I want to leave you with one last word if you had anything left to say.
I just want to express my gratitude for this, to the National Portrait Gallery for doing this work, for getting more of this out here, and to encourage us all to continue this conversation beyond our time together. Thanks especially to Larry, who, I mean every word I said. I'm just so grateful for you and your work. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So this has been really fun. It's also very meaningful. It's been very powerful. We've had a series of conversations to prepare. So I am also very thankful to the National Portrait Gallery, to the Smithsonian Institution, to Tommie, Pegues, and Donald Capoccia for sponsoring this series, to Mindy Farmer for moderating, to Patrick Johnson, who has been doing a lot of the behind the scenes. I'm so excited. I have seen some friends in the audience, like my friend Catherine Benamou, and also Taina Caragol. And Lawrence La Fountain-Stokes. So it's so wonderful. One of the nice things about this is that this will be recorded, so many people can see it in the future on YouTube. So I encourage people to see The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson on Netflix. I encourage you to read Martin Duberman's book of Stonewall, but also to read some of the extraordinary work being published by Susan Stryker or by other transgender scholars. It's really crucial. It's really important. It was not taught in school, at least when I was growing up. And it's still not taught in school in many places where people want to ban this kind of conversation. This kind of conversation is crucial and is appropriate for people of all ages, whether you are young or old. So thank you so much once again.
And thank you to you both. This was Julio's idea from the beginning to have this, and we're really honored to have this portrait on display, and that's not a usual thing. So right now it's in our struggle for justice. So if you come to the museum, you can see it up, and it's amazing to see on a screen. It's even more amazing to see in person. So I highly recommend that you come and visit while you can. It'll be up until around this time next year. It just went up maybe last month. I also want to encourage you to visit or to attend more of our portal shows. There's another one coming up that I really want to highlight. It's called Painting Nostalgia, which is Jewish. It's painting nostalgic Jewish portraits at the Metro Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. It's on Tuesday, September 20th at 5 p.m. And it's with our incredibly special and talented guest, Simona Dinepi. She's the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Curator of Judaica at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And that's going to be moderated by my colleague, Kate Clark-LeMay, and as part of the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. And I've seen some of that slideshow, and it's just going to be amazing. I really encourage you all to attend. And I thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your questions. We appreciate your engagement. And just thank you so much for supporting this program. I hope you can attend that next event. And with that, I will bid adieu until next time. Thank you all for coming.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adiós. Muchas gracias.